Hello, and welcome to the R3 podcast. Today's episode tackles the very real challenges facing restaurant owners in today's economy, from the impact of work from home to rising costs. The industry is navigating significant hurdles. I'm joined by Andrew Bailey, partner at Turpin, Barker, Armstrong, and is also a licensed insolvency practitioner. And we'll be discussing how empathy and a clear plan of action can make all the difference. We'll also explore the importance of in-person consultations or meetings in truly understanding a business's situation and how to find the best path forward, whether you're a restaurant owner, an R3 member, or simply interested in the dynamics of business recovery. This episode offers valuable insights. Like with all podcasts, it is important to stress that whilst care has been taken in the preparation of this podcast, it is intended for general guidance only and does not constitute legal advice. Before I start, a word from this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by the R3 Contentious Insolvency and Creditors Forum 2025, which is being held on the 19th of June 2025 at number 11 Cavendish Square, London. So join us for the forum as we bring together the community of contentious insolvency and restructuring practitioners. To book your place, please visit the R3 website. I'm just kidding. The podcast is not actually sponsored by the forum. That was a mere plug. But if you are interested in sponsoring any episodes of the R3 podcasts in the future, please reach out to the R3 membership team. On to the episode. Welcome to the R3 podcast, Andrew. Thank you for coming on. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me.
Pleasure. So, as always, I'm going to dive straight in, as I know you're busy. So, as you know, Andrew, this episode was born from a LinkedIn post I saw from you some time ago now about a meeting you had with a restaurant owner facing significant business challenges. The section of the post that sort of really stood out to me was the part about the human aspect of balancing business ownership with family life, which ultimately helped you build that rapport with the owner. So what I'm hoping this podcast with yourself today reinforces is the importance of empathy and understanding the personal circumstances of business owners, which can lead to more productive and effective solutions. So, Andrew, can you share a time in your career when you realised the human element was just as important as the business numbers?
There's probably a couple of instances in my career. I think going out on site, so going to visit business premises and sitting in on a meeting with staff. So I've had to sit in various meetings with staff where, unfortunately, you're making redundancies. And I think going through that process and seeing that, you realise about the human element and that there's people involved in these businesses. Also becoming an appointment taker. I think when you're more junior in your career, you sit behind a desk, you're looking at your screen, emailing, possibly phoning people. But until you have those face-to-face situations with business owners and you see what they're going through, and I think when you're an appointment taker, there's that added responsibility that goes with it. So I think you realise that it's that much more effective when you're meeting people in person.
I totally agree. And it's funny, coincidentally, I attended the R3 employee working group yesterday. And one of the things I was talking about was empathy. And that when you're making those unfortunate decisions in terms of redundancy. So no, I totally agree. So moving on. So what's a common misconception people have about insolvency and restructuring professionals?
I think a lot of the business owners, what I tend to find is once you've had a meeting, they will often say to you, I'm so relieved, I wish I'd come for advice sooner. So I think there's a perception that it's scary going to get advice and that they're going to get judged. Perhaps they feel like they're up for what's happening to their business and it's failing because of them. So I think there's vulnerability there that perhaps they think they're going to get judged by somebody. And I suppose the best way I'd look at it is it's a bit like you're going to the doctors and you're vulnerable. You're going to be saying to someone, can you tell me what the problem is? And it's very hard at times to hear. You fear the news, don't you, of what you're going to be told. But actually, once you've gone to get that advice, it's not as bad often as you expect it to be. So I think that's the misconception, is that you're going to be judged and it's just a bit scary having to take that advice.
Thank you. So, as you know, this podcast is now on open platforms. So what do you hope listeners, not just R3 members, will take away from our conversation today?
I would say don't be scared of getting advice. It's a case of, look, there's solutions in advance even of approaching somebody like me. So obviously as a licensed insolvency practitioner, someone will come to me where a company's in financial difficulties. I think if you can almost get ahead of the game and look to find solutions that help you avoid even having that conversation with someone like me, but equally if things get into a bad position, then licensed insolvency practitioners are out there to offer solutions and talk to you about what the difficulties are you're facing. And there are solutions ultimately out there to deal with any of these scenarios that you come across.
Yeah, and that's the message that we've been pushing out for many years now, is for directors or individuals just to seek that advice early, because like you said, it opens up options. So yeah, thank you. So moving on to, should we say, part 2 of the conversation, the human side of business. So in your experience, how does approaching a business challenge with empathy change the dynamic of the conversation?
For me, I don't think there's really any other way of dealing with it. I think you've got people coming to you that do feel vulnerable, they're concerned, they're worried probably how the implications for their personal circumstances as well. So I think if you can approach it that way and show actually, look, there is some care here, you're genuinely trying to help them, that itself makes people more relaxed, and then they come to trust you and actually realise that you're not there to judge them and tell them how terrible it's been and what it's going to be awful going forward. You're there to be trying to find a solution for the business, and ultimately hope that helps that business owner as well. And I think if you can show that empathy, they're often more open with you as well. So even though you might start a meeting where they're possibly a bit reserved, you look at each other and check each other out, eventually they realise they can trust you and they're much more open. So you'll just get much more out of it by showing that empathy to them.
So understanding the personal circumstances of business owners is crucial for IPs.
Yeah, the personal difficulties that I think business owners face. So I think sometimes that can lead to the struggles that a business might be facing. So if you've got an individual that drives that business and they're personally struggling, sometimes that can lead to the actual business struggling itself. Or on the other side of it, it can be the consequence of that business struggling. So when they see it slowly deteriorating, that can take its toll on people. So when you speak to business owners, you've got to understand the personal side as well, because you need to factor that into the situation and how you might be able to manage it going forward. So as an example, are they capable of supporting the business going forward, or have they got themselves to a position where it's just not feasible for them to continue? So do they have the energy to continue to support that business and perhaps run through a strategy that you think might be the best outcome for everyone? As an example of that, we have businesses where we might be going to HM Revenue and Customs, for example, to put forward time to pay proposals. You might have a board of directors that are very passionate, energised, they're turning around the business and they want to find a solution to avoid an insolvency. So if you can get a payment plan in place, that might be critical to the turnaround. You could have a very similar scenario where you might have directors that have just lost energy for personal reasons. They may no longer be able to support the business, and therefore you're going to have to look at a different strategy to try and get the best outcome. So I think understanding those personal circumstances absolutely is critical, really, to whatever the strategy is that you're going to put forward.
Yeah, like you said, director fatigue. I mean, since 2020, it seems like it's been non-stop. They've been hit. There are some out there who may not want to go on, but there are others that have that enthusiasm, that drive to carry on. So have you seen a situation where focusing solely on the financials initially hindered finding a solution?
I had a case where there was, understandably, there's a huge amount of focus on the financials, and we had problems getting quality information that would enable us to, I suppose, support the strategy that we were trying to get put forward. And albeit financials are absolutely critical, I think sometimes you're not going to have that quality information in every case. And I think the focus was so much on that, the financials and why they couldn't be produced in any meaningful way. It almost took the eye of the board away from where it should have been. So as an example, what was happening in the background, which is not always obvious and won't immediately show in the financials, is that we had, this was more of a construction type business where you had client work was slowing up because there were problems on the premises in terms of supplies. Suppliers were then going on stop as well, employees leaving, morale dropping amongst the staff as well. And then the core team leaving, so your internal finance team were leaving, which again led into the problems with the financials. So I think sometimes there's these other factors in businesses that, again, are so critical to the functioning of the business that whilst financials are really important, these other factors need to be considered as well. And I think the outcome of that was, because these other factors had such a big influence, it meant perhaps we weren't able to get the outcome we could have done if the decision making had been a bit quicker at the start, and recognising that this financial information just wasn't going to be produced in a meaningful way that was going to help us.
Thank you for your honesty, Andrew, there. So moving on to part 3, the challenges facing restaurants today. So of the challenges you listed in that LinkedIn post I mentioned earlier, working from home impact, rent, changing behaviour, cost of living, national insurance changes, etc., which one do you see having the most widespread and significant impact on restaurants sort of right now?
Yeah, there's such a long list, isn't there? I would say, again, it's almost evading the question. Sometimes it's business specific. I think all of these factors you've just listed there, I suspect most restaurant owners would say they're all impacting us. And it's almost like this perfect storm, and a lot are entwined. So some of the ones I've seen, just thinking about some of the lists we've had, the working from home impact. So I think one you mentioned about the LinkedIn post, that was based next to offices, hugely dependent on office workers. And when post-pandemic, there just wasn't the return numbers. So that particular restaurant was very specifically impacted by the working from home. I've got others that staffing was an issue and customer service was an issue, specifically because they decided they needed to close the restaurant because it just wasn't feasible to operate on a Monday, Tuesday. Because of that, staff that wanted a full-time job were leaving, and the only staff they could get were part-time, which were younger people, probably not as experienced, and therefore the quality of the customer service deteriorated. I've had weather, it has a huge impact. So the amount of cases we see which sounds bizarre, but you think of those with outside space. If it's colder, then people are just not going to be drinking as much outside, having a good time in the gardens. I don't think I could say that there's one particular factor. I think on each one that we see, it really does vary.
So for a restaurant owner listening who's experiencing one of or more of these issues you spoke about, what's the first thing you would advise them to do?
I would have a bit of a list of things. And I think this is focused on businesses that they might be thinking, look, we have got some problems, but perhaps there's scope to turn it around or improving it. So I would say understanding the numbers quickly is really important. So I think for restaurant owners, it's such a busy and demanding job. A lot of the business owners are often working in the business. Hours can be really difficult, and they're trying to cover. People are absent just to keep the business going. So I think for a lot of these restaurants, it's understanding of numbers and getting probably an accountant on board that can help you with this, or bookkeeper, so that you're on top of the figures all the time to understand performance. So I think if you're receiving information from your team weekly, and then your accountant perhaps on a monthly basis, you can look at it, because you just cannot afford to let the figures slip. I think any of your dishes and drinks need to be costed when they're added to menu. So the cost of good changes constantly, and that needs to be fed through to menu prices following suit. So it's a difficult one in terms of pricing. I think it's acting on the facts. So strong financial information helps you understand where you've got issues, and then you can put together a plan to address these issues. So if you've got performance indicators that you can measure on a regular basis. So if your gross profit on drinks has dropped, do you need to recost those drinks and put prices up? And then you can sit with your accountants and look at those changes. I think the really awkward one that I think a lot of business owners will be reluctant to do is putting your prices up. So say costs of goods have gone up, labour is more expensive, and that cost has ultimately got to be passed on to the customer to make the business viable. I think probably changing the way you do business is also important. So adapting to any changes. So you might have had a business model that's worked for a long time when the financial environment was a bit stronger. But as things change, you've got to adapt to that. And perhaps you've got to rewrite your business plan, look at what you can change. Are there earlier services or later services? Do you need different menus, less bulk preparation, different products? So there's a lot to think about. And then finally, looking to the future, I suppose a lot of restaurants, it's seasonal, isn't it? Looking at winter, Christmas might be busy as well, but then you're looking into January, February, which are particularly hard. And you've got to think, what's your plan going forward? Can we kind of mitigate that with events, guest chefs, closing on certain days? So I think there's those sort of factors. I think there's a lot to think about for business owners and a lot to juggle. And I think it's whether you can get that support from perhaps your accountant and others that can help.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Andrew. So what are those early warning signs for a restaurant owner?
Again, thinking about my case, is it cash? Cash is king, isn't it? It seems to be the phrase everyone talks about. And it's when you see cash becoming tight, do you have suppliers on stock, disgruntled suppliers that might not be getting paid as quickly as normal? Can you see that customer numbers are dropping? Has something changed there? And I think from, I suppose, a business owner's perspective, are they having to put money into the business to prop it up, or are they not drawing salary to make sure everyone else gets paid? I suppose, is payroll becoming a problem? Is performance different to previous years for the same period? So I think there are indications there, but I suppose it comes back to these financials as well, is if you are monitoring them on a regular basis, you'll be able to pick up on it quite quickly and hopefully adapt to that.
Thank you. Moving on now to part 4, the importance of in-person consultations. So can you share sort of a specific example of a complex case where an in-person meeting revealed the sort of crucial details that might have been missed sort of remotely?
Yes, I think I attended site to meet a director, and I was there for the day. I was meeting valuation agents and other advisors down there to plan out the assignment. And this was prior to the company going through an insolvency process. What I noticed was the director's behaviour was a little bit erratic when I was there. So he would disappear for long periods around about lunchtime and come back in a slightly different state. And when that happens, you have to take that into consideration of, look, it's going to be more difficult to plan. And is he going to be engaged in the strategy going forward? So I think it's things like that that you need to take into consideration, or whether we need to get more support from other people. But there were other things that we noticed just randomly. All the walls in his office were bare, but there were nails stuck in the office. It was only through speaking to other people, again on site, that I'd found out that he'd removed the pictures because they all had racehorses on there, which he owned. So it was funny things like that. Take the nails out of the wall if you're going to be doing that. And then on this case, we also there was invoice finance in place. So there was a lot of scrutiny and focus from the lender on that. And in the build up to the appointment, I was getting more concerned, again, because of the director's behaviour. So one of the things I did was I turned up on site at one point unannounced, just on the pretext of I'm just checking in to see how everyone's getting on. And I found a huge amount of finished stock that was sitting there that they were hoping to ship out without me noticing and without that being reported to the voice finance lender. So there were things like that. Going there for the day, sitting in front of someone, you could get a gauge of how the assignment was likely to play out and that you may need to be a bit more careful. That was the benefit of going down there on that particular case.
No, that's fantastic insight. I think you've covered my sort of next question about the non-verbal clues and insights. So moving on, for business owners who might be hesitant to schedule an in-person meeting due to time constraints or the fact that we live in a Microsoft Teams world, what would you say are the key benefits they might be missing out on?
Well, I think Teams and Zoom is really helpful, isn't it? I think it's saved lots of time for people, but equally, I think getting in front of people, a lot of it is body language, isn't it? A lot of the time. I don't think you can get away with people naturally wanting to be together. And there's a bit more quality, I think, in terms of the conversation when you're in the same room together. I think speaking on the phone or Teams, it just drives slightly different behaviour in how you communicate. When you're speaking on the screen, you almost feel like you can't stop talking, you can't look away, hesitate as much. And I think so some of the meetings I might go to, people might just consider their answers slightly differently. They might even, if we're at their premises, be able to pull in another team member if we need to have a conversation with someone or go and find some information. It's generally a slightly more relaxed environment as well when you meet people in person. I've found over time that difficult conversations are much better to have in person. So if I'm communicating with a director, perhaps after appointment, where I need to say to them, look, this has been identified, we need to address this. There's a problem, there might be, we need to come to you to recover some money. Having that conversation and actually explaining it to them in person feels to me a much better way of dealing with it.
Thank you very much. So moving on to part 5, developing a plan of action. So when you first meet a business in distress, what are the initial sort of data points you sort of prioritise to understand in the situation?
Initially, I will look at the balance sheet. I'll say to them, if it's not readily available, and sometimes business owners won't have that to hand, that I'll get them to talk me through the balance sheet just so I get an idea of what the position looks like. And then it's a case of, right, what's the performance look like going forward? So have we got any projections to work out what the business is going to be looking like in the future? Sometimes it might be a case of, look, there's no opportunity to trade going forward. Things are only going to get worse and there's no scope to restructure and do anything with it. But for other ones, it's a case of put that information together. Can we have a look at what those projections look like and test those to see how realistic they are? But ultimately, it's the director. They're often the best source. If you can get them to be open and explain the background, how they see things going forward and whether they've got the energy to go forward, then I think they're probably the main points I'd take from an initial meeting.
So then how do you balance the need for sort of those realistic financial projections with the often emotional state of business owners facing financial difficulties?
It's a really difficult one because I think they're entwined really. So in an ideal world, if there's an internal finance team that can produce some of this financial information to try and take the pressure off the directors, but I think you've got to gauge what you can realistically achieve as well. So some businesses will be more sophisticated and they have more readily available information that they can give to you so you can make more of a judgment based on that financial information. But other ones, it just isn't there. There's very little point in asking for those projections when it's not achievable. And if anything, you put obstacles in the way. It's a difficult one. I think you're trying to manage the business owners as well and try to not to, I suppose, add burden and make it more stressful. Equally, you need some quality information to enable you to make the right judgment and give them the right options.
Great. So when I was early in my career, I often thought to myself, like, how does an actual IP approach the subject of insolvency with a business owner director? How do you approach that? I mean, the directors are going to be emotionally attached to the business. How do you approach that conversation about potential insolvency options with business owners who may be resistant to the idea?
So I always take the view it's their decision to make. You don't want to feel like you're pushing people down a certain route without them being comfortable about it. The key is making people comfortable that they can trust what you're telling them and they know that you genuinely listen to them rather than coming into a meeting thinking, I've already decided this company just needs to shut down. You want them to, bearing in mind the emotional attachment, you want them to know that they can trust you. So they take your options and what you're telling them on board. You'll go through that background, you'll present the options to them. It's important to talk about their duties, so their fiduciary duties as directors, so they recognise that they do have responsibilities and they can't blindly continue without taking reasonable steps they should be doing. But businesses are at different stages when they come for advice, so that advice varies, but it's part of a journey, isn't it? You meet a director, you'll go through the options, and then over time, some decisions can be made quicker than others, but others you might need to work with for a while to get them into a place where they're comfortable making that decision. And that's where you've just got to make sure they bear in mind those duties so that when they make their decision, obviously they haven't done anything incorrect in the meantime.
What are some of the misconceptions about insolvency that you often need to address at these meetings?
I think a lot of it comes from the friend down the pub advising before they come to us. So a lot of business owners will come to us and think, I'm going to get disqualified. So that's one of the immediate concerns. So we need to reassure them, but equally let them know these are the things that will be looked at. So we talked to them about bounce back loans or HMRC. So there's a lot of scrutiny around that. So being blunt and honest with people to say, these are the things that can happen. We have to report on conduct on every liquidation administration so they're aware. But that's one of the things that I think they immediately think because the company is going through an insolvency process, they might be disqualified. It's similar with bankruptcy and possibly losing their home. So again, they'll be worried about personal liability and don't always understand the protection you'll have with the corporate veil. So again, it's just trying to make them a bit more comfortable with that. The more uncomfortable misconception I've had that they have a certain perception if you're talking about pre-pack administrations and buying back businesses and assets from administrators. I think there's a misconception that they're done at an undervalue. I'll get a friendly administrator and sell a business and assets on the cheap and get it back to start up the next day. So having very frank conversations with business owners about that and the importance of going through and doing these things transparently and correctly to make sure that everyone's comfortable with the transaction. And if a creditor asks a question to say, why has this happened? You're there and you can answer and provide the rationale behind those transactions. So I think they're probably the main ones that I come across.
I think it leads us nicely on to sort of exploring outcomes and options. So how do you approach the often difficult conversation about the owner's personal goals and desired outcomes for the business?
I think you've got to be fairly blunt and honest with them about it, where they've got, I suppose, their personal goals, and if those conflict in any way in what their duties are in terms of what they should be doing for the company. I think you often find is the director is entwined with the business in any event in terms of goodwill. So if you're looking to sell a business on or turn it around, they're so key and entwined with that business that you need them on board, and often their personal goals generally will fit quite well with the outcome that you're looking to achieve. Yeah, more often than not, they're supportive of the strategy that you're trying to achieve because it makes sense to them. There might be a benefit to them personally in the strategy you're trying to achieve. And ultimately, if you were trying to go ahead with a strategy that was entirely negative for them and not benefit them or impact them negatively, then they're not going to be supportive of it. So I think it's managing expectations with them and explaining why they have these duties to support a certain strategy and accepting that it might not necessarily benefit them all the way. There's a key difference between them personally and the company. And I think it's quite key a lot of the time because they view it as almost like their personal business. So it's trying to manage that expectation.
So how can the business owners then effectively weigh the emotional attachment to their business against the practical realities of its viability?
Advice helps. So when they're in that business, they're dealing with it day to day, trying to keep it going. They're investing so much into that business emotionally and probably financially. I think it's very difficult for them to see the wood for the trees. And I think sometimes if you can get advice or, somehow detach yourself from it to look at the business, how it's performing and how it's viable, that's critical. So if I looked at some of our cases where I've seen it go wrong is where people are so emotionally invested and they don't have the visibility going forward. They put more of their own money in, or they might take out more loans with personal guarantees attached. Or you might have a case where they're continuing to trade when they should have known that it wasn't viable to continue. And these lead to personal liabilities. So I think if you can get advice, which helps you get an independent view on it, I think that is important.
What gives you hope when you work with businesses facing significant financial difficulties?
So the people in any business will drive the outcomes a lot of the time, whether they've got the energy to achieve the potential in a business. So sometimes we might have a business owner that comes to us and you can see that they've just been impacted by one particular event or there's just some misfortune there. And you think, actually, there is something here that can be rescued and that will ultimately lead to preservation of jobs. So I think the potential in the business gives you hope. But I think the critical bit for me a lot of the time in what our strategy is going forward is about the people involved in that business, whether that's the business owner or if they got key people in there that can determine the outcome.
So people are key. So what's the biggest lesson you've learned from working with business owners, sort of navigating those tough times?
They're all different. So you've got to be adaptable to the different people that you're dealing with. And I think you've got to be patient with a lot of people. So you don't want to be pushing them or be perceived to be pushing them a certain direction. But equally, it's trying to be clear and firm with them and having quite a clear message. Going back to this, you're trying to get them to trust you. You've got to have confidence in your decisions and make sure that you're giving them the right advice.
We're wrapping things up now, but this is probably not a one piece of advice answer, but I'm going to ask it. What is the one piece of guidance you would give to a restaurant owner listening right now who feels overwhelmed by the current challenges their businesses are facing?
I would go for financials and getting visibility of performance. So it's such a difficult sector to work in at the moment, and it takes its toll emotionally, personally for the directors that are there. So they need to be brave, and obviously it does come with some cost, but getting an accountant or bookkeeper that can give you quality information of your financials and visibility so that you can look at your current performance, you can look at your future viability, what changes can you make, how quick can the turnaround be if you make those changes. And then also, are things that bad that you need to consider alternative steps. So do you need insolvency advice and to look at the options there? But I think in the first instance, it's get that visibility of your financials so you can really drill down into every part of your business so that you then have that visibility and you've got people on board with you that can actually support you. So you're almost delegating that financial support to other people to help you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Like I said, this has been a really good conversation. I really do hope restaurant owners out there do have a listen to this podcast because there's some real valuable insights and guidance you've given. So thank you. I'm going to end with a question I ask all guests on the R3 podcast, which is, what is the one thing you've learnt during your career so far that has stayed with you throughout?
It is to ignore or I'd say manage noise. So in our type of work, I think you find that you're often dealing with disgruntled stakeholders. So that will be creditors, employees. You might have upset directors at some point, shareholders, lenders, whoever it might be. And I think in our profession, in a way, you've got to back yourself and be slightly cold in your decisions so that you're comfortable about what you're doing. So you have to manage all these different stakeholders, but be very clear in what your strategy and your decisions are. The one main lesson I've learned is when you make those decisions, be comfortable that if you sat in a room with someone and they were going to give you a grilling about why you did this, be comfortable that you can sit there and say, this is why I did it. And you're not worried about anyone picking holes in it. So I think it's a case of just being confident, make sure you're rational about those decisions you're making and back yourself.
Fantastic lesson. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today.
Lovely to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the R3 podcast today. I hope you found the discussion informative and useful. And thank you again to Andrew for joining me on the podcast. Should any members or anyone really wish to be a guest on the R3 podcast, please contact me. My contact details are on the R3 website, or you can simply message me on LinkedIn. Keep well.